The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Professor Michael Levitt, the biophysicist, author, and lecturer. In 2013, you received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the development of multi-scale models for complex chemical systems, and you are currently a professor of structural biology at Stanford University. Your early predictions on the spread of COVID-19 went dramatically against mainstream opinion, and yet they are now described as being remarkably accurate. You've also criticized the use of lockdowns as a medieval weapon to combat the pandemic, saying they cost more lives than they save. Professor Levitt, welcome to London Real.
Thank you very much. Glad to be there, George.
It's great having you here. First of all, I just want to announce that we're streaming now on our brand new Digital Freedom platform, which is a censorship-free, independent broadcasting system that is of the people, by the people, for the people, and available exclusively on our website at freedomplatform.tv. Can everyone watching us now please share this link via the sidebar to all of your social media channels? Just ask your friends and family to give us 15 minutes and then they can decide. Professor, I pledge to you and everyone watching us that none of this conversation will be edited, censored, removed, or banned, and that anyone in the world can watch the full version of this episode free at londonreal.tv/Levitt. Thanks to the generous donations of over 32,000 people around the world that I affectionately call the London Real Army. For anybody wanting to become a founding member of the Digital Freedom Platform, they can go to freedomplatform.tv/give to donate and fight with us on the front lines to protect our human rights. At London Real, we've been a platform for free speech since 2011. And Professor, I'm excited to have you here today. You know, I looked at an article the LA Times wrote in March 23rd, and it was quoting you, was saying, we're going to be fine. And I think, you know, now in June, people forget how back in March, everyone in the world was terrified. We thought that this was going to be, you know, something that was going to literally decimate the world. And yet you were bold enough to make a statement back then. You know, why did you make that statement then? And how do you have the confidence to stick your head up and say something like that? Because in the scientific community, you were probably one of the very few saying this.
So I would say, firstly, you know, late March, a long time ago, but I had been involved in this since late January. So late March was like the end of month 2 for me. And because I'd seen what happened in China, in Wuhan, in the rest of China, I realized that this was a virus that in some way was self-limiting. And we can say more about that later. The other thing is that by looking at various examples of places that were hit very early on, but hit very hard, we got some estimate of what I call the population fatality rate, i.e., forget about cases, forget about infections, just ask if you have 1 million people, how many of them are likely to die? And the numbers that we saw were sort of more than flu, but maybe not more than 50% more than flu. So in that sense, since flu was a very dangerous disease, a bad disease, the one that was accepted, it didn't see any way in which a disease that was sort of comparable, that was in any way burning itself out, was going to do a lot of damage. So actually, when I said that, I really felt confident because the numbers that I'd had by then, there were a lot of numbers. And Italy was almost reaching a corner at that point, which was a terrible, I mean, Italy was the first pandemic or epidemic that really was out of control. So, you know, looking back, it doesn't seem like I was particularly brave. I was surprised by the headwind that I got into. And generally, I was, you know, my explanation is that everyone was panicked and wasn't thinking straight because people were very upset with me, oftentimes my scientific colleagues.
You know, that must be strange for you as a scientist and, you know, and a researcher and an educator to go into the political storm like this. I mean, again, you were looking at the numbers and analyzing this from a scientific basis. You probably never have ever jumped into such a maelstrom.
That's true, but I'm also a very apolitical person in the sense that I go and watch a tennis match and I don't really care who wins. I mean, I love the game, or I'll go and watch football or soccer versus rugby, and I like the game, but I'm not a very tribal person. So for me, it was very difficult because, especially in the USA, where I was invited onto Fox and I was invited onto CNN, and they really only wanted me to say what they wanted to say. So that was actually a little bit of a surprise. But after a while, you get the hang of it, and you realize that one thing I had to explain is that the numbers are very, very honest things. People always talk about the numbers being forged or whatever. You can usually tell very easily if a number has been tampered with because there are certain self-consistency things that go on. And as I got more and more used to numbers from all different places, I realized that the numbers are all telling the same story. And that gives you a feeling that you can interpret the numbers in one way or the other way. But we basically took a very simple approach. I should also say that the work of my entire career has been with dynamic trajectories, essentially how things move. And in some ways, an epidemic is a dynamic object. I mean, it's the number of infected people starts low, goes high, it stops, and so on. So they're almost like equations of motion that epidemics can adopt. And if you sort of learn a little bit about the beginning, like if you see a football on a certain trajectory, you can sort of guess where it's going to go to. And that's sort of what happens with an epidemic as well.
Interesting. And so you were looking at kind of total deaths when everyone else was focusing kind of on deaths related to COVID-19. And so they were seeing this kind of geometric progression, but you were looking overall and saying, this actually isn't geometric. It's something, like you said, looks like...
I can explain it very easily. So okay. One of the very confusing things about epidemiology is that they use this RT number, the R number as a function of time. And it is a really, really hard number to calculate. Because basically you say that the number of cases today depends on the number of cases yesterday and the number of cases the day before, because a person can infect, say, for a whole week or 2 weeks. So it's a very complicated sum of all the previous cases multiplied by some sort of unknown numbers. So it's a very uncertain number. In an epidemic, the total number of cases or the total number of deaths is a well-defined number. If, for example, you look at the number of new deaths or new cases, it turns out that in the Western world, there's a huge kind of periodicity that comes from the day of the week. There are usually very few cases on Sundays and lots of cases on Fridays because people take the weekend off and they don't count the cases and deaths. So, but the total is more or less reliable. So the thing I did at the very beginning, and it seemed like a very obvious thing to do, but going forward, it's actually been kind of sensible. You take the number of cases today, the number of cases yesterday, and you divide the number of cases today by the number of cases yesterday. So let's say there were 100 cases yesterday and 120 cases today. That gives you 120 divided by 100 is 1.2. That basically tells you that the number of cases has increased by a factor of 1.2 or by 20%. Okay? So that sort of says that if it's growing at 20% a day. You can do this with your bank interest or anything like that. Now, if things are really growing exponentially, you'd expect to get that same factor the day before yesterday and also tomorrow. So now you can wait a day and then take the number of today, divide by the number yesterday, and get the number. And what you find very, very quickly everywhere is that that ratio is getting less and less and less. So if on day 10, the number of cases is growing by 30% a day, then on day 11, it's growing by 28% a day. And day 12, it's growing by 26% a day. And you get this very steady decrease. And this is something which is not what you expect from exponential growth. If when you put your money in the bank, that's exponential growth. Compound interest is exponential growth. But you sort of expect, if they're giving you 10% a year, you don't expect to get 10% and then 9% and then 8%. And if you did, you wouldn't get very much money after 10 years. So basically, you see this in all the viral growth. And that was a surprise to me because it indicated that right from the very beginning, and I think in China, I started looking at the numbers in day 10. There was only data for 10 days at the end of January. But to see this same decrease. Now, you have to be careful because if you have a very small number, say you have 5 cases today and 8 cases tomorrow, then you'd say, well, 8 divided by 5 is 1.6. But 8 and 5 are such small numbers that you wouldn't believe that. if it was 80 divided by 50, you'd feel more confident. So you have to sit and wait a bit until you have, say, 100 cases. But then this measure works really well. And what we've seen everywhere, this number just gets lower and lower. And we've now found mathematical properties of this number. It actually, there's all sorts of things about it that everyone is now plotting. And it basically relates to a distribution that comes from a British scientist 200 years ago called Gompertz. And he had this distribution to describe how people get old. And essentially, this is a distribution where every day the bank pays you less interest. And it's a little bit like you get, and this is actually what's happening and everywhere COVID is described by this. So for this reason, the problem with COVID is the spread. Because clearly, even if, let's say, London has an epidemic, you probably can't really control what's happening in London. By the time you have, say, 1,000 cases in London, you probably have it spread everywhere. But you can stop it going from London to Manchester by just simply saying, no trains, no planes, no cars, nothing. And that would be useful to slow down the time it gets to Manchester. But actually in London, it's not going to make too much difference what you do because everyone's infected. And even then, it's very hard to stop people living in the same town from not infecting each other. And this is the reason lockdown doesn't really help. I mean, social distancing is a good idea. I was just reading that in England, one of the major benefits was just washing your hands and maybe wearing a mask, practicing better hygiene. Washing your hands is not a big deal. But I think that there's something very strange about lockdown. I must say, I was shocked that any country adopted lockdown. The Chinese did it because they were very confused. They didn't really know what was going on. And they probably succeeded too well. Because although in the province of Hubei, where there are 60 million people, sort of the size of Italy, the infection spread quite well. Outside Hubei, there were only 13,000 cases. So that means in a population of 1.3 billion people, they had 1,300 cases. And this means that there must be very, very little infection among that population. So this is a problem because there's no reason why it shouldn't start up again in mainland China. They can probably keep restrictions and people there are very good at wearing face masks and having their temperature monitored and stuff like that. But, a very important thing about this epidemic is what is the end point? And all this discussion about was lockdown important in England, was it not important? Again, the trouble with lockdown, it's obviously an effective measure, certainly. If you took everyone on, if the day we heard about the epidemic in China, we had locked up every single person in England, there would be no infection. You can't get an infection if you don't see anybody. But that might have not been a good idea because if you don't have a vaccine, you want people to get infected. And
right.
Anyway.
Two questions about that. When you see that lack of geometric progression, and like you said, maybe it goes from 20% to 18% to 16%. I mean, that tells you something about COVID-19 as a disease. And we know it's highly contagious, but is it also telling you that for some reason it seems to kind of fade out after a while? I mean, I know you're not an immunologist per se, but what does that tell you about COVID-19?
I think what it tells you is that as there are more cases, it's harder and harder to find somebody to infect. And that's what it really means, because if every day you could find new people to infect, then nothing should stop you growing. And the reason is probably, there are a number of possible explanations, none of which I think are determined yet. So one explanation involved asymptomatic cases. So this would mean, let's say I'm the infected case, and on day one, I get infected, but my three brothers also get infected, but I don't know they're infected, and they don't know they're infected. And maybe I don't feel so good, so I sort of stay at home, I'm careful, but they're feeling great, they're out on the town. They're infecting people without knowing it. Then when I sort of feel a bit better, I want to go and infect somebody, they've all been infected. Now, that explanation depends on having asymptomatic cases being infectious. The World Health Organization released something that they want, although apparently it's not actually correct, and I'm not going to go into that. Another explanation would be that some fraction of the population already has some immunity to COVID. Now, you might say, well, how is that possible? I mean, this is a new virus, except that it's coronavirus, and half the viruses that cause just regular good old common colds are also coronaviruses. So people are now also finding, immunologists, that there's some potential cross-reactivity, or perhaps that the immune system is primed to be able to make antibodies to corona very easily. The bottom line is that in every major epidemic, every major outbreak, things have eventually burnt themselves out. And you could claim, but I don't think that would be true, that they've all been managed very well. But then, you have northern Italy, you have Spain, you have the United Kingdom, New York City. These didn't give one the impression of being very well managed, especially when they were finding out that most of the infected people had been infected before they were locked down, that the subways and tubes had helped spread the disease. And when you look at all those people, you find that the number of people who have died, and I don't think death is important, but it's a proxy for how many people are infected. We can't measure infection, and it seems that although most of the deaths are people who are older, nobody is able to protect anybody particularly well. So deaths are a proxy for how much infection. In any case, the level of infection we get to is about 500 per million, which is 5 per 10,000. It's 0.05% of the population. So it's less. It's about a half per thousand. Now this means that for Italy, you expect something like 30,000 deaths. For England, maybe the same sort of number. What's interesting is that Sweden, which definitely hasn't practiced medieval lockdown, they've used some level of common sense social distancing, also looks like it's getting to the same number. For Sweden, the number would be 5,000 or 6,000 per 10 million. So it's again, we're all getting this number. Now, New York City is a bit of an exception, because in New York City, the number of people who have died is closer to 1,200 per million, even 1,500. And, I don't know. It's hard to tell. I think we see some interesting things in the numbers. So, for example, in an area that we've analyzed, a very large area, is all of Europe. Basically, with this set of data, you analyze the data where you find it. You look under the lamppost. You can't go out and collect data. But in Europe, there's a very good organization called EuroMOMO. MOMO is monitoring of mortality, and they basically count total deaths from every country every week, and they update it every Thursday. So probably by now there's a new one. And when you look at the EuroMOMO, what you find is that there's a peak that corresponds to COVID. There was also a peak that corresponded to influenza 3 years ago. If you look at the people who have, the extra people, if you like, who've died during the COVID peak, you find that only 8% are under 65 years old.
8% under 65.
Yeah, if you look at the mortality figures in New York, it's more like 30%. That's a huge difference. And, it may be due to obesity. It may be due to the lack of a universal health system. It may be due to poverty. I would guess, but I don't really know, that New York is a city that probably has very big extremes of income. There are some really, really rich people there and some quite poor people. So these things all could give you this. Also, there's a lot of older people living in nursing homes. I mean, New York City, in some ways, the Upper East Side is a great place to be old. There's great museums, you can walk everywhere. And as a result, I think they have quite a number of aging people. But it's still surprising. The same number is actually true in other US locations as well. So, we're studying this, but there's just a limit to how much I can do. But it makes me feel that essentially what's happening with COVID is that in every population is a certain number of people who are susceptible, not susceptible in terms of the disease, but are vulnerable in terms of being infirm, having other conditions. I often think about it as a forest, and there are some trees that are just getting kind of old, broken.
Yeah.
Big wind comes through, those are the trees that are going to fall. And that's what seems to happen.
Talk about the age, because you've been, very vocal about, first of all, highlighting that a lot of these cases are older. And obviously there are the comorbidities, and also how we don't seem to discern between a 20-year-old life and an 85-year-old life, and the fact that the marginal gain of keeping an 85-year-old, alive one more year is obviously a significant cost. Can you just talk a little bit more about your thoughts on that?
So it seemed to me to be obvious. And what surprised me was that people thought I was being really, really cruel. And I would say to people, okay, so, I'm 73 years old. I'm very aware that I've had 73 great years. I have a 16-year-old grandson. He's out of school. He's in California. His life is being endangered for me. And I kind of often see this thing in terms of the young versus the old. I'm a baby boomer. I was born in 47. Had it really good. I mean, when I was growing up, everything was opening up, easy to get into college, easy to get a job. We didn't have to compete with the generation above us because they hadn't really made it. And we had the best music. We had, everything was coolest. And we've got to remember that we're no longer, we still think we're the greatest thing on earth. But the fact is that all those young generations are the future. And I think there was a little bit too much emphasis on this. People will say I'm obviously wrong, because a lot of young people, will call me a granny killer. Now, my mother actually lived in London, and she's 105 years old. She's actually fine. I chat to her by Apple FaceTime quite often. But I still think that if we in a society, it is very self-serving for the old to think that they are more important than the young. Insurance companies handle this very well. If I want life insurance, no one will give it to me. They're going to say, at 73, you think we're crazy? Whereas if an 18-year-old wants life insurance, they'll give it to him. Now, no one's going to say, well, gee, this 18-year-old hasn't been to college, he doesn't have a Nobel Prize, we should give it to you. It doesn't work like that. You get a chance to live, you make the best of you can, and then you move on. But quite frankly, people, when I spoke like this and I tried to explain to them about indices like years of life lost, YLL, years life lost, or disability allowed life losses. These are things that insurance companies use. All doctors use this. If I went to my doctor and said, okay, I want a heart transplant. Gee, I'm a good guy. Maybe I'd get it at Stanford Medical School, but it wouldn't be fair. Because the fact is that you've got to give people, if you always let people who are older get more, then the young are never going to get a chance. And as a baby boomer, when I was growing up, I had it easy because all the people who were above me had the terrible time of growing up in the Great Depression or the Second World War. So, it isn't fair. But for whatever reason, and I kind of fear that there'll be a backlash, and that at some point the penny is going to drop and the young are going to say, okay, to keep somebody who's 85 alive for an extra 6 months, you've basically put me into a financial situation where I can't buy a house, my business has failed, I'm not going to be able to afford healthcare for my kids. In other words, and it's not fair. So, but I still don't understand, you could argue maybe it happened because most politicians are baby boomers, or maybe the media was spinning the story. It was very prevalent, especially in Israel, where, no one dared to talk about the things I've just said to you about years of life lost, or that perhaps, a soldier killed in the line of duty at the age of 20 is more than somebody who's lived a very full life dying from corona, because everyone dies from something. Dying naturally of old age, nobody dies naturally of old age. And even if you die in your sleep, it might be a stroke, it might be a heart attack. So, everyone dies of something. And just because you die with a little sticker on you saying COVID, that gets you onto the front page of the New York Times, whereas in the same period, another 600,000 people died in the USA from exactly the same age group, but they didn't die of COVID. So they didn't get memorialized. Now, if they had been, soldiers in any of the wars, that's special. These are the people who have really given their lives. But, no one who died of COVID really, and I think the hospital staff are different. Medical service people did give their lives to COVID, and they're the heroes. But they wouldn't cover the front page of the New York Times. There might be 500 of them at the most. So I think there's a lot of, I would say, dishonesty almost. I really don't believe that people really believe this. Although I must say I'm very active on Twitter now, which I love. My Facebook friends, many of whom aren't my Facebook friends anymore, would not buy this. They felt that death was death, and it didn't matter how old you were. So
I mean, I know in America as well, there was kind of financial gain for classifying as COVID-19, because I think you got the federal funding for the hospitals, and the hospitals, some of them were going bankrupt anyways because the rest of the wards were empty. And then I heard there was extra funding for putting them on a ventilator. And then, of course, it seems like the reclassification was, to the benefit of mainstream media for eyeballs, or politicians to justify this medieval lockdown. Even in London now, it seems like, why haven't we stopped this lockdown? But it feels like if we stop it, it feels like they lose face because it makes them look like they made a bad decision. But I mean, the economic sacrifice doesn't seem worth it.
It definitely wasn't. You know, if you look at the economic sacrifice, and let's just say, so again, taking all of Europe, where there's very good numbers, the total death toll from COVID in Europe, and Europe was definitely hard hit, is 30% more than the flu of 2017-18 in Europe. Now, that wasn't a particularly bad flu year. I think 2009 was worse, but I wanted to use exactly the same database, essentially on the same page they have the last 4 years. So they have COVID as a peak in the excess death, and then they have a peak in 17-18. And when you add those up, you find that the COVID it might still go down, but up till now it's about 30% higher than the flu, but it can well come down because there would be people who died and others. Now, when you look at those deaths, again, in the age groups, the age group deaths from COVID are indistinguishable from those with flu. In both cases, 8% under 65, and in both cases, 50% over 85. So that is really the burden of death in Europe. And I think Europe is, and that includes England. I mean, the United Kingdom is in there. So they're part of this whole thing. And then, it may be worse in other countries, but that's sort of the excess. And it's not much worse than flu. Now, the economic burden it's not just the economic burden, but the economic burden is going to be huge. It's going to be very hard to restart economies. I've seen this in Israel, that now we're about a month out of the lockdown. A lot of people don't really want to work. It's interesting. I guess I've been working harder in the last 4 months ever before in my life.
Me too.
People have been reading, I'm sure, but a lot of people haven't. And and I like working. I love my job. But maybe if I was, packing vegetables, I'd say, well, gee, it's quite nice to be at home with my kids and so on. Then also there's a very big price socially. I think in Israel, there's been a lot more domestic violence. I think a lot of kids have had a hard time being with their parents. I know that in the United States, suicides are going up. In some ways, it's been a massive tear in the social fabric. That may be a good thing. Usually after things like this, you get a reshuffling, and people who were excluded can become included again. But it's a very strange phenomenon, and one which makes me realize that the world better smart up very soon, because we've got some big ones coming down the pike. I mean, global warming is not going to be something like this at all. It's going to be infinitely worse.
And what about, or do you believe there will be another pandemic where there is something that's much worse?
I don't know. I think that it's very easy to predict disasters. People, there's going to be a meteorite hit the Earth. There's going to be an atomic explosion. There's going to be, and by and large, from my own experience, and I've lived for 73 years, we got through the Cold War. We got through the massive arsenals of weaponry. We basically had the world has had a very, very good 70 years. And the fact is that things are better now than they've ever been before. They may be. I would actually hope that this will be like a dress rehearsal for smartening up. And, we need to start thinking a little bit less about ourselves, maybe a little bit less focused about likes on social media, more about the real life. It was a thing that we were sort of drifting into a time when, automation would take over all the work. We would be unemployed. People would live forever. And that no longer seems so likely. And it's a good thing it's not, because there's an awful lot of people for whom that wouldn't have been the model. That was the model for the top 1%. And I think we need to flatten our societies a bit, because societies that have massive inequalities are not really healthy places. it's interesting that in Europe, the two most sort of egalitarian societies are Iceland and Ireland. And they have, this is usually measured by something called the Gini index. And the Gini index for those two are really, really good. Other places are not nearly so good. And then you get to Brazil, and Brazil is the worst in the world. But Brazil is about probably 10 times less equal in terms of the richest to the poorest than Iceland or Ireland. And that has an effect. If you live in a country where there's this vast disproportionality, it leads to instabilities. And I think what we're seeing in the United States is a kind of instability. I don't know. But I'm not really worried too much about the future. The one thing I am worried about, I mean, in general, you know, you could say there's going to be another outbreak, but basically this one, for everything we've said about it, was, you know, up to 30% worse than flu. Okay, big deal. You know, I mean, that's important, but we can obviously, maybe next time flu comes along, we all wash our hands for the flu season. I mean, that would probably save a lot of deaths. Maybe there's a way to protect people in nursing homes. Maybe they shouldn't even go into nursing homes. Again, a complicated issue. The one that really worries me is global warming. I think, you know, I don't think anyone can stop the world from getting warmer in the next 50 years. I think nothing we can do is going to stop, you know, and it doesn't have to be catastrophic. We're already seeing unusual weather. I was in London in February. My mother lives in London. I was visiting her, and, you know, all the trees are blossoming, and, you know, it feels like spring, but it's February. I think global warming is a very interesting phenomenon because most crises, you can't tell they're coming. But global warming is going to be a crisis that's coming. We don't know where it's going to hit, and it's going to be tough. It's going to be very tough because most of the world will be much less inhabitable than it used to be.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that thought. You know, it's interesting what you say about people going back to work because, you know, we're kind of opening up in London. I think as of Monday, non-essential businesses are being encouraged, and yet I think a few things are happening. First of all, Professor, there's a lot of people that are still very scared. I feel like the fear campaign was way overdone. In fact, there was an article written in one of the papers that said they now need to have another campaign to get people out of their houses after the campaign to keep them in the houses. Luckily, I've been able to speak with people like you over the past 8 weeks, so I've never been in fear, but a lot of people are. At the same point, I think a lot of people have more gratitude in their lives and they appreciate things that they didn't used to appreciate, people, social interactions. Maybe also they view the rat race in a different way. Maybe they don't want to work jobs they hate to buy things they don't need, right? The classic Fight Club scenario. So I think there's that. But I do think we'll see cities fundamentally change. And like you said, in Israel and in London, it doesn't seem like anyone's rushing to get back here. And it's like you said, maybe I don't think the economy is going to snap back, and it is a new reality. And we're going to have to see, you know, and again, I just want to get your thoughts on the lockdown. I was surprised too that everyone fell in line. You know, if we had to do it all over again, would you do it where perhaps the older people were protected and the younger people stayed at work? Or, you know, how do you think we should have done the lockdown, or should we have?
Okay. So I've been in Israel since the end of February when I came here from London. And I was discussing lockdown with some pretty senior people here in the middle of March. And, you know, I told them it's crazy to lock down the young people. What you should do is take all the young soldiers and put them on cruise ships and let them get well infected. Because for herd infection, you don't have to infect everybody. You know, if we manage to infect 25% of all the young people, you have very few deaths, and we'd basically be safe, because getting old people infected is kind of a waste because they're not very mobile. I mean, the point about the infected people is they dilute the pool in the same way that if you had pre-existing immunity from common colds, you delete the pool. When I'm out there looking for somebody to infect, but if you have people who don't move around much, they don't help. But this was not considered. But I think in Israel, I felt that there were political reasons. But then every other country did the same thing. You know, I honestly don't know. I think sometimes when I'm feeling very Machiavelli, I would say that the virus here was the idea of lockdown, in the same way that we have computer viruses, you know, that get money out of Nigeria and stuff like that. These are usually just stories that spread. And I think for whatever reason, people started to lose lockdown, and I don't know whether it was politicians just enjoying the power. We can make everyone stay at home, without realizing that this is a major responsibility. I think the sociology of what made everyone do it. Now, whenever you ask somebody, they say, well, we had to do it because, Ireland says we had to do it because UK did it, and UK says we did it because Italy did it. But if they actually looked at Italy was, not such great lockdown. Italy locked down very, very late. And then, of course, we have Sweden. And Sweden is going to put egg on everybody's face because Sweden is going to end just where everyone else did. So I think the lockdown is a truly strange phenomenon. Maybe some of your other speakers have addressed this, but it's something which I think is really, really interesting. It's almost like a psychosis, a global psychosis. I always use the example of that radio broadcast in the 1930s when the Martians had landed and everyone panicked. The leaders panicked, the people panicked, and then they just kept on reinforcing themselves. What surprised me was that I got a certain amount of hate mail. Some of the hate mail was just people who didn't know what they were doing. And what I actually did at one point, I took all the hate mail and I made one email of all the hate mail and I copied everybody. And that stopped them immediately because they all saw what other people had been writing and how silly it seemed. But I actually got some quite serious letters from scientific colleagues, some of whom are pretty high up. And they were very angry with me because they felt that by diminishing the threat of COVID, the other people, i.e. the inferior, not academic people, would break the curfew and they would then infect me. And I said, all this panic is killing people. I mean, when you're panicked, it messes up your immune system. So basically, even if I'm wrong, I probably still save lives. And the logic here was very clear cut, but I learned a lot of things about others that I probably would have rather not learned.
About others? You mean, how so? With the hate mail, you mean?
Well, not just that. I think a lot of, people have said that, well, firstly, I became a Twitter user. I'd never used Twitter before, and now I love Twitter. I mean, it's my favorite community. It's almost to the point now where I want to start getting some unpleasant feedback because everyone is so nice to me on Twitter. But I basically went from 20 followers to 16,000 followers in about 8 weeks. Of course, increasing exponentially. But I mean, it's been great. But FaceTime was, my family members on this time got very upset with me. Friends on FaceTime. I think COVID is a bit like a contrast agent. When people do microscopy, in order to see cells more clearly, you put like orange dye on them. And then everything improves the contrast. And I think COVID is like a social contrast improver. Things that, if you like, social divides that seem to be unimportant suddenly became important. Thoughts about healthcare that seemed unimportant suddenly became important. I think a lot of liberties we took for granted suddenly became important. In certain countries, I think in Sweden, they actually couldn't have done a lockdown, even if they wanted to. I think in Sweden, there are no emergency laws, and they could not have actually, even if they really wanted a lockdown, all they could do is ask people to please lock down.
Right.
But the fact is that it's really, I see a lot of cracks in our society that weren't clear before.
Yeah, I saw that as well. And you learn about someone's character as well. How do you deal with fear? And everyone deals with it differently. And sometimes the tough guys crack, and sometimes the ones you think aren't so tough, the ones that step up. I'm sure you see this in military service in Israel and a lot of countries. When the pressure is applied.
Yeah. But again, for my own case sake, I always had the numbers, and right now we have more numbers than we've ever had. We've got writing a paper that's going to be submitted very, very soon. We've analyzed every single outbreak everywhere in the world. I mean, this is a completely global analysis. We're a little bit concerned about Brazil. Peru seems to perhaps be turning a corner. And in Europe, Europe is pretty much fine, except one worries about perhaps second waves in southern Italy, but I don't think so. I think second waves will not hit Europe. It's been infected enough.
And we see Brazil, and I mean, obviously they kind of ignored it for a while, or the president was famous for really not even talking about it, not even admitting it was there. Is that the problem with Brazil, because they didn't take the prophylactic measures?
No, I think the problem. Brazil is a big country.
Yeah.
It has a population that's about 2/3 of the USA. It's a big country, very diverse. The number of deaths they have right now is, I think it's about 30,000. They're still very much in growth phase. My guesstimates, but right now it's very difficult to estimate very accurately. They will probably top out at 100,000, and 100,000 will again be the same 500 per million. So we're seeing the same number now. Again, you can get higher numbers if you make sure that every single corner is infected, because I'm sure that in countries like France, some parts of France are less infected than other parts of France. Even in Italy, southern Italy and Sicily are way less affected than northern Italy. But by and large, this number. So I think it's going to be fine. And the other thing is also, I have had some video conferencing with Brazil, because I kind of feel that people are no longer worried so much about COVID in the northern hemisphere. They're going to be fine as well. I don't see anything special about what they're doing or not doing. I was quite impressed by the scientists I talked to there.
Okay. Now, Professor, you're a scientist. What's your read on vaccines? I studied engineering. I was a science fair geek when I was a kid. And so for me, the science of vaccines always was attractive to me. I always got my vaccines. But in the past 8 weeks, I started speaking to people like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and a lot of other doctors, and started looking at the execution of vaccines and the vaccine industry and the lack of liability and et cetera. And now I'm really questioning if that is this ultimate solution. I'm wondering, have you looked into it, and what are your thoughts?
Well, I've been on lots of panels, and I've heard people. On the past Friday, there was a panel actually held by the European Molecular Biology Lab, where they actually reached out to scientists, and there were 4 of us. And one of the people was a vaccine expert with Dr. Klein-Smith, and he said that to develop a vaccine actually takes about 20 years, and because vaccines are given to everybody, safety is incredible. So if a vaccine, kills 100 per million, that's about the same level as COVID. You can't tolerate that. He said that in past epidemics, when they rushed to make a vaccine, it was usually ready afterwards, and not in time for the thing. Coronaviruses, it would be a really good idea to make a vaccine against the common cold. I mean, the economic costs of common colds is huge. And if you could get vaccine once a year and common cold for that year, people would queue up for that. And they can't. So I just don't know. I think that, one would hope that science has improved. In some ways, it's very sad to say that we had a medieval lockdown. We could have had a smart lockdown in many, many ways. I mean, the phone could have been useful for other things than food delivery. And it really wasn't used that way. So I don't know. My feeling is that most of the northern hemisphere is okay, perhaps except for China. So the one country that has a massive need to get a vaccine is China. On the other hand, China might be able to control this in a smart way by people are very well monitored in China. Whenever you cross the road, you're photographed. My guess is the same cameras that are photographing you could easily take your temperature by putting in an infrared filter. Whenever you go to a store, you're photographed for temperature. People wear masks all the time. Right now in Shanghai, people are wearing masks and might continue wearing masks for the foreseeable future, certainly on the underground and things like that. So they might get away with it, but they really would like, I'm sure, to have a vaccine. So maybe that's where the incentive will come.
Why does China need it? Why does China need it more than anyone?
Because they haven't been infected yet. I mean, if you look at the USA, the infection rate is a couple of 100 per million. In China, the infection rate in China is...
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.